The beacons of Fair Isle had two voices, and Mara learned them before she could write her name. In still weather the south tower purred, a soft glow that made the sea look like poured tin. In wind or fog the west beacon hissed and glazed its panes with salt, the flame tearing long white scarps into the dark as if to cut a path home for ships that had no right to come. Nights like this felt like standing watch at the lip of some breathing thing. The wind lifted in slow gusts and sank again. The sea worked itself, endlessly patient, against the long reefs that threw white in every season. And in the workings of its noise she could pick out the weather, the pull of the tide, and sometimes the pulse of oars far beyond the line of foam. Her father slept in the cottage on the lee side of the hill, a man gone fleet and light with age, and she knew he would wake and tramp up before dawn to check the oil and the shutters and to scold her for keeping both flames so bright. Not every night needs two lights, girl. Oil does not grow in the dunes. But he had been a sailor and then a wreckmaster and then a keeper, and he knew the weight of a dark horizon, the way it could draw a ship into its hunger. She kept the west light high now because she could taste weather on the wind. Not rain. There was that salt metal tang that came before a squall, but not the fat wetness that promised a soaking. She thought of the two lighthouses her house had tended for 3 generations and of the old story her grandmother told when the sea kept them inside for days. Of Alyssa Farman who had stolen eggs from under dragons and fled from Dragonstone to find her own world. There was a picture of her in a faded book that had come across from Lannisport with a clerk who loved ships. A lady with wind-burnt cheeks and a gaze set on the west. Mara used to sit on the beacon's cold stone and press the book open with her knees, learning the names of sails and spars the way other girls learned the names of flowers. Toward midnight, the wind swung a point, and in that turn she heard wood and/or touched water. She stilled, cupping a hand to the glass. The west light threw a wedge of gold onto the black, and in it drifted a shape too low for a trader and too sleek for a war galley. It slid from gold into dark as it passed through the knife of light. 3 heartbeats later, another followed. Then 2 noses canted to the swell. Then a mess of them, the way starlings will, a pattern that is not a pattern unless you know the flock. She pulled the shutter to narrow the beam and stifled the urge to ring the village bell. Fair Isle had learned the hard way that a bell at the wrong hour could pull raiders like gulls to a net. Instead, she took the horn her father used to wake the harbor and blew once, quick and low, toward the cottage below. If he heard, he did not show. She blew again. The third sounded a little while to her own ear, and she cursed herself, gathered her hair into a knot, and ran down the spiral steps. Her father was already at the door, boots in one hand, the other rubbing his eyes. "I heard," he said, and then, with a glance at the shape of her fear, "Hush, if it is them, we have time enough to light every prayer we ever forgot. They move like iron folk," she said. "Oars low, no lanterns. 5, then more. Every fisherman in case can pull without a lantern," he said, and then, after a breath, "But you're not wrong." He turned to the chest and dragged out the old tube and its nested glass. The Myrish lens was the finest thing in the house, a present purchased for a lord's son who never returned to take it. Her father swung it to a small hole in the shutters, knelt, and drew in a long breath. "Black sails," he said quietly. "No house colors. That's not case." She could not help herself. "Crow's eye, or any crow who thinks he is an eye," he said. "You keep the light as it is, not more and not less. Don't go blind trying to see what men like that hide." She rubbed her hands together. The panes were sweating under the breath of the flame, and the stones sweated too. "We should send a raven." "We will, but we do it clever. Wake little Tansy. I'll write for Case and for the Rock. For Lannisport too, though they act slow as honey. If the red wines kept a wing out past the Mander with this wind, I'll drink the lantern oil." Her father wrote the way sailors reef, quick and neat and all economy. 2 ribbons, 2 little sealed stones, 2 black birds, and Tansy's small hands that knew how to knot a message to the leg without crushing it. When the birds were away and the ink was capped, he stood on the step and listened. The wind had freshened. Somewhere beyond the line of the light, a drum began to beat, soft and slow. "If it is Euron," Mara said, the name tasting queer in her mouth, They say he cut the tongues from his crew. They say a lot. They say he drinks shade of the evening, blue to the lips, and sees the world as a god might. They say he sails a ship that never has to tack. A ship is a ship. The sea is the sea. Tend your fire. She went back up and thought of tongues. She thought of the men who put their decks under other men and knelt in other men's work, of the iron folk pressing close to a strange island in the dark, and what they would do if they thought the beacon meant welcome. By the time the first of the longships stole into the shadow of the western reefs, Mara had marked 9. There were more because she could hear them. She tightened the beam again to a cut, not more than a finger's breadth at a mile, so any captain searching the coast would take it for a private light. She was not sure if she did it to spare them or to spare her island. They came without fear, those black sails trimmed and low, the oars dipping in and up, the wind at their quarter, the long hulls shaped like predators. On one she saw a figure on the prow, an almost casual weight, a head turned toward her tower as one might turn toward a friendly shore. The light caught a rim of metal at his throat and a ring that flashed, the rest all dark. She heard Tansy come up and stand quiet behind her, small bare feet on cold stone. If they mean to come ashore, they'll land in Gannet Bay, the girl whispered. The wind is wrong for the North Cove. I know, Mara said. Go down. He'll need you. The third time the drum sounded, it was closer. She reached down to the handwheel and, for the first time that night, took a sliver from the flame. The men who had come from Case were already tucked into the gorse and the little folds of rock above Gannet Bay, and Mara had not asked where their ships had gone. Their captain had brought no colors either, but he spoke the rock's tongue and moved his men with the economy of men who had worked together for years. For a day and a night they had sounded the shore and salted the sand with casks and kegs, rolling them into scoops and clamping them, stringing tarred rope from driftwood to driftwood where the tide would lay it, in the way of wreckers but with a sharper mercy. If you knew the threads, you could pull and kindle a fire that would walk along the foreshore as the tide came in, a line of heat riding the tide's lip. If you were foolish, you'd step your ship into it as if into a wedding garland. He had come to the door and asked for a pinch of salt from Mara's hand. It helps the wind know a man's name, he said with a half-smile that did not ask for her belief. When the time comes, I'll give it back. She wondered how much the rock knew and how much they guessed. She wondered who had told them that a flock of black sails would come skimming up the coast, who had counted oars in the dark. She wondered if Lannisport had learned to plant fires at the sea's edge since the Blackwater, or if this was older, some trick Adam Marbrand had learned when he rode out to burn raiders in the dunes. She stood with the west light narrowed and watched the first of the Ironborn take the bait. The longship slid toward the darker stripe that the tide made when it pulled weed and silt to itself. A watcher might read that stripe as a channel. A sailor who knew Fair Isle would not. But these were men from the north and the west, moving too quickly on the back of their own fame. There was a moment when she could have opened the light and thrown gold over the bad water and saved them, and she felt it like a fishbone under the tongue. Then the drum beat again, a little boastful as if laughing, and she thought of the women in the village, the nets cut, the few coins lifted from jars wrapped in old cloth where only children and wives looked. The first ship came into the line of rope. Its oars clattered. A man on the prow turned his head in that small human way when something is wrong. The tide, so harmless, took hold of the tarred hemp and kissed the lines of pitch and opened every little belly of sapped pine they had hidden in the dunes. The captain from Case pulled a spark from a traveler's lamp and blew low, and the grass along the foreshore woke in orange and then in white. The fire ran the line as if it were a harp, each not a note, and when the pitch caught the flood gave it teeth. It moved out along the shallow like a serpent seeking ships. Men shouted, and the shout made another light in Mara's mind. She had never heard iron folk shout like that. They were too proud. They had songs about a sea so dark you could only find your way by taste and memory. But the shallow fire was a new thing and a cowardly thing, and cowardice makes all men loud. The first longship caught along its length and for a moment floated in a bed of light that made its black sail look holy. Mara swallowed. The men leaped to the oars to push off, but the tide plays with oars when it wants to, and the flaming rope had twined like a clever eel around the steering board. The air took the sail took the spark became a sheet, and the ship became a torch that the sea held in both hands. The second slewed, clout its neighbor, and that kiss of hull to hull was enough. Fire knows where would remember's sun. It crawled up and over and under, found the tar the shipwright had used to seal seams, found old oil in old boards, and found the men. She saw a figure with hair like pale wheat throw a bucket, and another toss a cloak, and another take a knife to a rope that had already burned through. She shut her eyes and opened them again, because to keep a thing closed is to let it eat you. The drum beat no more. In the stack of black behind the burning ships, she saw a different order asserting itself. Hulls backing water, some swinging north to reach clear, some slewing south to take the deeper channel. One ship stood like a rock, nose to the fire, its oars chopping rather than drawing, the men clean in the stroke. She recognized her without needing a banner for it. The way it rode, the absolute insistence written in the shape of its motion. Silence. The tale ran ashore with every trader and wrecker. A ship with a blind god's eye and a figure with a patch whose smile was a wound. The crow's eye loved a trick and loved the shape of doom. If he had been a boy from Fair Isle, he would have lit the foreshore himself just to see which way the flames took the wind. He would not panic. He would not fall back. He would come forward to test the truth at its hottest. The case men worked the second line, this one farther out. Their fire ships, poor wine boats and broken traders, had been soaked in oil and sewn with fishgut sacks of resin. They had a little stolen wildfire too, a lick here and there cupped in clay and prayed over, because the king's law was a thing the rock remembered only when it wished. Those boats had been poled into the line where iron folk would think a channel opened into safety. She saw them now, coming alight not from a torch but from an old captain's grief, white at first and then green, and the green was like a city burning under the sea, a cathedral of glass and hunger. Silence did not break. She stood her bow against the green flame, and the men at her oars matched like a heartbeat. Mara could not see their mouths to know if they had tongues, but she saw their arms move and their backs curve and straighten, and there was no falter in them. They took the longship across the burn where the wildfire faltered, the water starving it in rips and holes, and in those holes the ship slid and lived. Another ship came after her and did not find the holes. It went green in a breath and then red in the same breath, and Mara thought then that the drowned god was a cruel little god compared to fire. The sea lets you go, but fire wants all of you. Silence made it through the second line, and for a moment Mara felt the world stop. The longship stood clear in the dark water beyond the shining, poised on the lip where the deep begins to talk to the sky, and the figure at her prow turned and raised a hand, not to his men but to the island itself, as if he could sense a gaze and would take it too. She had the wild thought that he could see her, that the patch hid the eye he looked with and the other was just for men. Then the wind leapt. Nothing in the world moves like a squall that wasn't there and is. The west lights' panes boomed. The flame tilted and ran high. Every rope and shutter spoke at once, a clatter like dry bones. The fire on the foreshore blew flat, flashing a blade of heat out toward the ships that were already burning, and in that breath the third line, a net of oil that no one expected to catch, came across the surface like a dark pain being drawn. It touched the curve of Silence's hull, kissed up the sides, and climbed. There are men who curse in that instant and men who pray and men who sing, and what Mara heard from that far shape was nothing at all. The oars kept their tempo. The ship kept straight. The prow figure turned again, one hand at the rim of his patch, and then the flame took the sail at the seam where the cloth rubbed the mast, and the mast cried like a living thing. At Gannet Bay men shouted in the rock's tongue and in one of the harder iron tongues too. Some were their own recruits, Mara knew, from the least villages on the west shore. The iron folk were too proud for it, but a few had gone south in old hunger years to sell swordwork to the rock and had come back with rings hidden under scars. She went down because the light would keep an instant without her, and because her father, though he would never ask, would be at the bay. The path was old, the stone steps scrubbed by 1,000 seasons, and the night had a taste to it that was mostly kelp and smoke and a little bit of something that made her think of blood and old copper. On the headland above the bay, the case captain stood with both hands in his belt. He did not smile. His clerk held a slate under a bit of oiled silk, and in the green pulse flashes he made marks as if he were in a counting house. "How many?" Mara asked, though she had seen enough to make numbers feel obscene. "Enough to sing about for a winter," he said flatly. "Too few to end the song." "Is it him?" "Might be. He does not die like a man in a boat, but a flax rope burns like any rope. His kind like to live by names. The sea likes to live by laws. We'll see which wins." She followed his gaze back across the water. The air between the fires was thick with smoke that did not rise and with a wind that could not decide who it loved. Ships were trying the back door of the bay now, the narrow notch where a man in a coracle could sneak out in fair weather. "If they find that channel, they'll ground and we'll gore them," the captain said, not unkindly. "We have hooks. Your men know this coast. We'll pay for every boy who comes to pull. I'd have more boats to push them off if I dared light a lamp in the village. But I'm not asking your bell." She looked back at the towers, her towers, west and south, 2 candles on 2 different altars, and thought of her grandmother's voice in Stormdark. "Any light is a promise, child. A light says a human hand is here to keep you from falling off the world." The old woman had stared at the glass like a mirror and said, "I knew Alyssa Farman like I know this wind. She would not have doused for a lord." "Do you want my light quenched?" Mara asked. The captain's head turned a fraction. "If I say yes, will you hate me afterward?" "I don't know," she said truthfully. "I might hate myself. Then do what you can live with and I will do what I have to live through." He touched his breast where, if he were a reach man, a mother's token might hang, and then he called for his men to run another fireboat down to where the smoke opened. The men went without drama. She admired them for that. She had seen men go to spears shivering and talking and making jokes that were too clever for their throats. These laid hands on rope and pushed. The squall came full. The rain began without small talk, straight down in stinging lines that skated off oil and bit at unlit wood. Mara ran the slope of sand like a deer and climbed the beacon steps 2 at a time, water coming off her like a net. She reached the flame and laid a hand against the iron to feel its mood, and the flame told her, "Feed me." She fed it. The west light brightened in a long inhalation. Through it, the bay showed its truth. The burning ships had spread. Some had run together and made a single garden of flame with masts like black bones in it. Some had drifted apart and were dying slow, the green still licking in the hollows. Between them silence fought like a man bound in tangled hair. There was a moment when Mara thought she had gone clear again, and in that moment a different shape moved in the dark beyond. Broad and high and throwing water from a beak that was more castle than prow. The case men cried out, not in fear, but in recognition. A transport? No, the red wine crest would have flown an apple tree. But the motion was in that family. High-bowed, bluffer, built for sea more than for surf. The rain sheet blurred everything, so she worked the shutters to sweep instead of cut, and the sweep caught a row of shield bright or tips lifting, bright because the west light found wet wood. It was not red wine. It was a Westerman galley, the rocks, a thing kept back and then loosed when the fire did its work. Came down with paddles working, and behind it smaller cousins, 10 or more, coming in file. A long kermer bellowed from the headland, horn in a tone that lived under the skin, not like a bell at all, and the galleys turned to take the longships that had not yet found ruin. Mara saw one hook bite and hold and a second fly and miss and a third be answered by an iron-borne axe that cut the line as if that rope had spoken insolently. Men reached. Oars splintered. 2 hulls kissed and stuck. A man fell and did not show again. There was a sort of merciful wildness in how fast they made meat of each other. On the Silence's deck the prow figure had gone, and then she saw him again at the mast step, the black patch a new moon in the light. He had a horn in his hands, curved like a serpent's rib, banded in metal that moved a little in the light as if it were making up its mind. He put it to his mouth. Even across wind and rain and fire she thought she felt the horn in her bones. It was a sound that shook screws that had been set in stone for years. It might not have carried to the men at the oars, but it carried to the wood and to the water beneath. Wood answered. Lines of pitch hissed and flared and went flat. as if the horn told them they were only wood and should be ashamed of trying to be more. The oars took a new bite. For 3 strokes silence moved as if free. Then something homely in turf. Eend. An oar from the galley that had come up fast at her beam drove just so against Silence's rail, and caught just so in a tangle of rope that had been burned twice, once by pitch and once by luck. The oar snapped like a tooth in a jaw. The broken bit punched a sailor under his ribs. The ship lurched, not much, just enough that the next green mouth found the lower curve of her sail, kissed and ate. Men choose heroic deaths. Fire hands you the small stupid ones, the awkward elbow, the slip, the breath of wind that says now. Mara leaned her forehead against the hot iron and tasted salt that was not all rain. The sea boomed. The horn sounded again, or maybe she only heard it because she wanted to. The mast went with a sound like a tree in snow. Silence's men were men in the end. They leaped and hacked and sang nothing and then sang a little and then were quiet. The ship did not sink. Fire teaches patience to wood, keeps it afloat to drink its lesson. She drifted toward the west reef, lower, lower, like a dancer forgetting her step, and in the reef's teeth she gave herself up with a sound old women will tell stories about. In the gray smear of dawn, the bay was full of dead. Some were iron folk and some were Westermen, and the sea made no note of which. The rain slackened, a more reasonable weather moving in behind the squall, and the towers blinked as the air cleared. The south beacon was a polite candle against the day. The west was guttering, the last of its oil having given itself to the hard hour, and Mara banked it and covered it and let the lens go cool. She went down with the ropesmen and the village boys and the men who had learned to pull a wreck apart between memory and hunger. The case captain raised a hand at her and then used it to haul a plank into a better angle for levering. Silence lay in pieces along the farther bar, black and still, the eye on her prow half in, half out of water, as if the sea had only then remembered to be merciful and avert its gaze. Out beyond the bar, where the deeper channel heaved with a long breath, the rest of the fleet had gone in flight or in ash. Some had taken the offing to the north. A few had made the south channel, and narrow boats went after them like hounds nipping a stag's hocks. Gulls rioted over the nearer water. The dead washed as the tide allowed. "What will you do with them?" Mara asked, because the work would have voices of its own, and silence would make ghosts louder. "Count," the captain said. He looked as tired as a man who had been too long at an argument. "Name what we can. Burn what we must. Put stones on the pockets of the ones their kin might want. Then fish them in a day or two when the sea has changed its mind about keeping. That's for the priest. We have no sept," she said. "No septon either. Only a boy who learned his prayers off an old grandmother with missing teeth. Prayers from teeth or lips go the same way," he said. "I'll say a Westerman's. The drowned god will bark at me but take the work." Tansy came running, hair in her mouth, breath like a kettle. "A man," she said. "He came up like a seal out of the water. He's cut. He's laughing. He has one blue eye like a robin's egg." The case captain's hand dropped to his sword and rose again without drawing, because men like him did not want to show fear to girls. "Where?" "Under the west head, the cave with old rope in it. He spoke to me and he said, 'Take me to your light.'" Mara did not look at the captain. She had never looked harder away from a man in her life. It made the looking back worse. The west beacon tower stood a gray finger against a gray sky, innocent, exactly itself, as if a tower could never be anything but stone. She felt an old cold creep from her ankle to her throat. "Show us," she said to Tansy, and the girl took her hand because that is what girls do when something terrible has chosen their path. The cave under the west head was the place boys ran to when they were sure their mothers wouldn't guess. In summer it smelled of rope and weed, in winter of damp stone and dead dreams. The tide in this hour left a tongue of sand where a man could sit to talk his own courage up. He was there, in a puddle of water that had not yet decided to leave, his hair plastered black to his head, the patch on the wrong side because the eye under it was the wrong one. The other was the color of a shallow over sand. Cuts on his arms had blackened in soot and that soot had turned to mud. He had a wound at the hairline where a beam had kissed him while making up its mind to be a beam or a message. He smiled anyway, because the shape his face took at rest was close enough to a smile to make a lie easy. "I didn't think lighthouses had daughters," he said, and his voice contained a kindness that made it worse. "But gods are sinners too, so perhaps lights do as well." "Stand up," the case captain said mildly, the sword at last a little more where it belonged. Euron Greyjoy, who had kept kings and captains looking slightly to the left of where they meant to look, put a hand down and then another to the sand to push himself to his feet as if he were merely drunk. He blinked. Salt water ran from his lashes. He looked at Mara as if the captain were a comment added in another hand. "I like this island," he said, as if making a private inventory. "It has 2 eyes. Most islands have only one. You should be proud." His lips were indeed stained, but not the deep, unearthly blue of the wine from Karth. He had drunk smoke and it had left its kiss. "Which of the eyes do you tend?" "The one that saw you," Mara said, though later she would not know why she said it. He laughed, not loud, and the laugh reverberated in the cave as if small gods approved its shape. "Does it see further than men can row?" "It saw you break," the case captain said. "Are you ready to end your day, Crow's Eye?" Euron's smile took a different curve and lost its kindness. "Men who ask a tide for readiness drown," he said. "Endings come without your permission. So do beginnings." He raised his hands, palms open. They were cut and grimed and cunning. "Take me then. But if you take me to a dungeon, bring a chair. I prefer to sit while I wait for the sea to give me back what's mine." "What was yours burned?" the captain said. "There is always more," Euron said softly. "The world is a book and you have read 1 page. Shall we read the next together?" The captain took a step in, and the cave made the step sound like a drum. "You'll not be reading anything soon." Euron's gaze slipped back to Mara, as if the captain were a servant turning a key, not a man carrying a sword. "Did you hesitate?" he asked her with genuine curiosity. "When they asked you to turn the eye away, did your light want to be a light?" Even then, she wanted to spit. Instead, she said the thing that rose up from some older place, some grandmother's mouth. "A light that saves wolves is a liar. A wolf who learns to see in the dark is a god," he murmured, and then he let the captain's men take him. They bound his hands without ceremony, and he made it a politeness by looking down. He walked out into the rain without asking for a cloak. The village watched from doorways that were suddenly obvious in their number. The bay boiled with work. The beacons stood like a pair of old men who had decided to outlast everything. By noon, the casemen had their raft of prisoners and their raft of bodies separated. The captain chose a stone on the headland for his table. He wrote names with care where he could find them: Harrag son of Harl, Ragnar Goodwind, Ralph Orkwood. Made marks for the nameless, and then marks for the Westerman dead that looked no different but felt different in the hand. He had his clerk take Euron aside to a place where the grass was thin and the wind pulled at words before they traveled. Mara brought the captain a jug of fresh water because a woman must do something with her hands when a man is counting. He drank, nodded, and set the jug on the stone. "You'll live with what you did?" he asked, not as a priest but like a man sounding a plank. "I'll live with what I spared," she said. "My island, the men I knew, Tansy's hands." She hesitated and then added, "And with what I didn't spare." The words tasted like iron. "I dreamed of Alyssa Farman when I lit the first light. It's foolish. My mother dreamed of salted apples," he said. "Dreams are only bread baked without flour. They fill you if you choose to believe." He called then for a boy to carry messages. "Tell the rock we have their crow," he said. "Tell the rock we have a pile of broken wings and a sea full of more. Tell them we will need wood and room and patience. Tell them to send a septon if they have one who can tell a lie without smiling." "Lie? That the gods look upon all deaths and are not bored," he said. "It comforts some to hear it." Euron stood with his hands bound and watched the light in the west tower breathe. He was humming under his breath. Mara could not help moving nearer to hear what tune a man like that hummed when he had nothing left. It was not a song she knew. It had no shape. It was like wind written down. "You think this ends me," he said without turning. "It ends a fleet. It ends a night's work. It ends a story a certain kind of man wanted to tell himself about my name. But there are more pages. There is a girl who tends a light she thinks is a promise. There is a priest who drowned and came up full of salt and words. There is a brother who would wear my skin like a shirt if it made him warm." He flicked a look to the north, almost absent, where no one could see Pike but every Iron Man could feel it in his bones. "You don't end men like me with fire. You end us with forgetting. We'll try both," the case captain said, coming up behind him with two men whose faces had learned to be stone. "I'll burn your fleet and I'll bury your name in paper. If that fails, I'll put you on a rock with a short rope and a longer tide." Euron's smile returned, gilded by hurt. "Ah, the old law." He turned his head just enough to graze Mara with that odd, polite interest. "Do you know the old law, light girl? A man is it until the sea takes it from him. Then he is the sea, and what he is not yours to name. A man is what he does," she said, which was something her grandmother had said when a preacher got stuck on what, exactly, a soul weighed. He laughed again, not loud. "We'll see." The beacons burned all that day in defiance of the rain. Men came and went. The captain put a signal on the headland and the second flight of galleys hove into view from the south. Apple flags wet, the red wines late but earnest, their oars slapping like apologies. They took the chase and the wreck work at once, in that reach way of doing all things in order until the order itself is a kind of pride. From the north other shapes were already appearing. Specks that would be Harlaw and Orkwood and Saltcliffe men scouting like crows after a hunt to see what meat remained. The rock's horns sounded and the red wine's trumpets answered. And between them the bay made a confused music that would take a woman with two lights a long time to forget. At dusk Mara went up to the west light and let the flame dip, not out of guilt now but from a keeper's care. She adjusted the shutter to a softer throw, something a little merciful for the men who were still in their small boats trawling for what the tide decided to change its mind about. The rain had gone. The clouds broke to a ragged edge in the west. Beyond the reef, where the deeper sea began, the last of the smoke curled like a young god deciding whether to be seen. She felt a weight on the stair and turned to find Aaron Damphair in her mind's eye, though he was not there. She had never seen him, only heard men talk about the priest who had drowned and seemed to like the taste of it. In her head he was a piece of rope left too long in salt water, a man held together by barnacles and belief. He would take this night and make a sermon with it. He would talk about pride and proper prayers and a God who likes a man better when he is cold and blue. He would call the fire an abomination and the light a lie and the sea a judge who never slept. She wondered if he could put his hand on a boy's head and make the boy stop shaking. There was a sound under the sound of the tower. It came up through the stone like a field in long wind, and Mara realized that it was the voices of men in the village singing. Not the Redwines with their apple songs, not the rock with its riding songs, not iron folk with the clatter they liked to make at oars, but Fair Isle men, and the tune was older than any of them, the one they sang when a boat came home with a man changed or not at all. It settled in the stone and in her bones and made her tremble for the first time since dawn. A little later, when the last of the fires on the water had flattened to smoke, she went down to the headland where the case captain had set his table. He had put Euron beneath a little lean-to of sailcloth so the rain would not give him the mercy of fever. It was a strange kindness, and she did not ask whether it sprang from policy or from the same part of a man that insists on taking the bad out of a wound even when you hate the man who carries it. The crow's eye lay with his hands bound and his eyes open, watching the light. He did not speak. His mouth had gone to a straighter line. "You should sleep," the captain said to Mara without looking up from the list he was making. "I'll wake your father if anything is asked of the light. We can tend it for a watch." She shook her head. He did not press. He made another mark. He set the slate aside and leaned back against the stone and gazed not at Euron but at the west, where the world stopped pretending it was more than water. "This will alter things," he said softly, not as a boast but as a man speaking a simple fact into air so it would know how to carry his breath. "There will be one less dream in the winds. Men in Old Town will sleep and not know they have been spared a nightmare. Men on Pike will wake to the sound of hammers and know it means something different than yesterday. Some lord in King's Landing will scratch a boil and smile without knowing why. That's the way of it. The big things happen out where no one is watching, and then a boy in a city smiles and thinks it's his own doing. If we're lucky, they won't notice at all, Mara said. Luck is men not looking at you. He smiled at that, small and real. We'll write it, though. You'll have the name of it here. It was a thing that happened in front of your eyes, and that makes it a piece of the world that can't be lied about later. The Rock likes records. Some men will say there was a storm, and some will say there was a god, and some will say there was a trick. We will say there was a flame and a rope and a tide. And a girl, Euron said, his voice sudden in the quiet and all the more human for it. Don't forget your light, girl. We won't, the captain said, and if he meant it as a kindness or a warning, even he might not have known. Night came again. The West Tower breathed. The sea made new plans, as if the day had been an argument it did not feel obliged to remember. In the cottage, her father snored without grief for once. Tansy dreamed of birds that took their messages to a place where birds got to sit like kings at long tables and gossip. In the cave where men had once kissed girls and told them lies, Tar bubbled under ash and smoked and would do so until rain came back to argue. Out past, the reef gulls settled, their small weight making a pattern the human eye reads as meaning because the eye cannot bear to think there is none. Mara sat on the step before the beacon with her knees under her chin and her arms around them and listened to the two voices of fair, I'll speak to each other across the wind. One was steady and one was stubborn. One sang for men and one sang for the sea. Between them a page turned that no one but her heard. She promised the old light that she would keep it from lies, and then she promised the new night that she would try to forgive herself for breaking a promise she had never made. Before sleep took her, a thought came like a bell struck very gently at a great distance. They would not put Euron on a rock in this weather and cut his throat to a tide. They would take him to Case or to the Rock and write his name in a book and try to keep names from remembering him. A man like that did not end in the neatness that made a clerk smile. He ended in a place where the light could not reach if it thought itself only for ships. He ended in men's dreams. She had given him a shape there, and in time she would regret the exactness of it. The dawn that followed found fair Isle cleaner than the night had deserved. The sky was a washed bowl. The clouds fled down the belly of the world like frightened sheep. On the sand, men used hooks gently, as if pulling a half-drowned thought from a river, and the captain spoke to each of the dead, Ironborn and Westermen, as if courtesy could soften the weight of the stones they tied into pockets. In the afternoon, a wind on a different point carried the smell of orchards, and the red wines set their sails and took the chase to the south, bright as toys against the open water. Late, when the day leaned toward gold, a rider came up from the village, mud to his knees, breath like a whistle. From the north, he called. A man with a rope for a belt and seaweed in his hair. He says the drowned god's angry. He says this is our sin. He says all our nets will come up with nothing until we give the sea the girl who doused the light. Mara did not stand because there is dignity in not giving certain words the courtesy of making one's height available to them. The case captain looked at her and then at the West Tower and then at the north in one slow sweep. There it is, he said. The other page. I didn't douse, Mara said softly. I only counted. Counting is what makes men think, he said. We'll see if this man learns also to count. He sent two of his best with the rider, quiet men who knew how to let an argument go past them like a cart on a road. Mara walked up the tower and put her hand on the warm stone, and for the first time she felt the old light answer her. It had always been a machine she tended for the sake of others. Now, with an iron priest walking toward her island with rain in his pockets and invocation in his teeth, it became something that would tend her back, a stubborn promise set into rock and oil and human patience. Euron laughed in his lean-to. The laugh was not for any man there. It was because the sea and the fire had finished their talk and had not yet closed their books, and he loved a page left open. Mara told herself that night would be slow, and she made it so by force of will. She walked the rings of the tower like a pilgrim around an altar. She trimmed and fed and steered. She remembered stories with their worn corners and the way her grandmother's voice dropped on certain words that even time had learned to respect. She left room in her mind for next steps she could not name. On other shores and other rocks, men who had never heard of fair I'll slept lighter or heavier for reasons they would never learn, and weathers gathered themselves in walls and in veils and in soft breathing under the ribs of the world, and a page turned where no one saw, and everything that had not yet begun ripened.